Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, leaving the entire island without electricity or potable water and killing dozens with a final count yet to come, Donald Trump reacted far differently than he did after earlier storms slammed Florida and the Gulf Coast of Texas. From complaining that Puerto Ricans seem not to want to help themselves, to criticizing the pre-storm debt crisis that left a lack of investment in the very infrastructure demolished by Maria, to unleashing a bizarre but sadly predictable barrage of tweets attacking San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz for her desperate calls for more and quicker help, Trump added insults to the injuries being borne by 3.5 million fellow Americans trying to survive and recover from an unprecedented catastrophe. Whether he intended it or not, President Trump has refocused attention on Puerto Rican status as neither a state nor independent, but a territory where they are American citizens, but do not send a voting representative to Congress or vote in presidential elections. While high percentages of Puerto Rican activists in New York tend to be independentistas, wanting the island to become a freestanding country and break bonds dating to the Spanish-American War, that sentiment appears shared by just a small minority on the island, based on local elections, polls, and non-binding referenda in recent years. The prospect of Puerto Rico becoming our 51st state, the first new state since Hawaii in 1959, is complicated not least because a Republican Congress would have to approve admitting a new state likely to send 2 Democratic senators and however many Democratic representatives their population would justify. Republicans have long championed statehood as an abstract concept. Reality has a way of changing that. And with tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans voting with their feet by moving to the mainland, doing nothing could change domestic politics as well. So many have gone to Central Florida that they could turn a purple swing state into a Democratic blue one. We want to take a look at the impact of the devastation of Hurricane Maria and the depredations of Hurricane Trump on Puerto Rico's status in the American orbit. Has it made statehood more likely? Has it awakened calls for independence? Or is the current status with its shifting menu of benefits and burdens one they are stuck with? We're joined by 3 people who take an active part in that debate. Jaime Estades is the founder and director of the Latino Leadership Institute, which not coincidentally recently opened its first satellite office in Orlando through the University of Central Florida. Dr. Maria Perez Gonzalez chairs the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College, which is my alma mater. And Howard Hills was an official in the State Department Territories Division under Presidents Carter and Reagan, and is the author of a pro-statehood book called Citizens Without a State. Jaime, let me start with you. We're quite a bit of time after the storm. What's going on the island now?
Well, it's a humanitarian crisis. Right now, 13% of the island has electricity. The water, there is no potable water. Even if you get water at home, you have to use purifiers in order to make sure that that is healthy enough to ingest. There are hospitals who have no electricity.
They're running on generators, right?
And those who have generators, like the Central Hospital in San Juan, is temporary. The electricity comes on and off. There are pictures that came out yesterday of a surgery that was taking place. And the electricity went off, there was no light, and they had to continue doing the surgery with flashlights. And
with miner's lights. I know the miner's lights on their heads, yes.
And that is more typical than not. The schools are supposed to start next week. Usually school in Puerto Rico, as you know, starts in August. They're gonna start next week. There are 1,100 schools in Puerto Rico. 25% of them are not going to be open, and they won't be open in more than a year. The Federation of Teachers is saying that it's okay with those 25, but there is another 25% that you think that they're okay, and we believe that they are not ready to be used by children and teachers. Therefore, I think that we need to revisit those schools again because we think that they are not ready. So you go through the issue of electricity, water, the lack of food. FEMA is distributing 200,000 meals a day for a population of 3 million. is 1 meal per day. And the communication and coordination between the White House and FEMA is practically non-existent, because if you believe as President of the United States that your job in Puerto Rico is a 10 out of 10, then you don't bother much in making sure that things are going to take place. You don't supervise that. FEMA is not communicating well with the government of Puerto Rico. So there is all these coordinations that are supposed to take place normally that are not being taking place, mostly because there is no will to make sure that those things take place. There are containers, thousands of containers still in San Juan that are not moving. They started to start moving slowly during the last 2 weeks, but it still is not enough. So there is the issue is not lack of food or provisions and medicines. It's just the fact that there is no coordination.
And there's no
They are not
roads in a
moving,
lot
there
of
is, there is
places.
no
Right.
distribution.
Maria, the governor of Puerto Rico, is a statehood advocate. Has this situation spurred discussion of status?
Well, first I'd like to say, many Puerto Ricans here in the diaspora are feeling the desperation, not only in the diaspora, across the island, because they cannot communicate, right, from one end to the other.
Cell
of the island.
towers are out, and
Yes.
phones are out, yes.
And in my case, my father, my uncles, my cousins
Where are they?
are there. They're in Isabela on the western part of Puerto Rico. And I have not been able to communicate with my father. And so this touches home personally.
Sure.
I've heard of him, but not directly able to contact him. So the situation is grim. And of the 5,600 roads, there's 4,500 that are impassable. So that, is a very serious situation in terms of trying to get goods, services to the people. But indeed, right? So yes, people are talking about the status. Of course, the people in Puerto Rico are not particularly talking about that, in the sense that they're in, survival mode. They need to recover, to restore. Many are fleeing out of desperation. So that's not the first things on their mind, right? Here we have a little bit more luxury. We're able to talk about the status, and I think that, yes, it does. The colonial situation, Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States. What does that mean exactly? It's a fancy name for colony. And so colony, that whole situation, sort of gives birth to the response that we have seen in Puerto Rico as compared to, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. The fact that most people don't even know that Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens since 1917 is obviously...
It was forced citizenship also.
Yes, it was imposed, right? They weren't asked. It was just given, granted, imposed, whatever word you want to use. But indeed, the Puerto Rican people did not have a say in that. So historically, right, from 1898, the Spanish-Cuban-American War, when the United States occupies Puerto Rico, invades, occupies, and then it's a colony, no issue about it. The U.S. Supreme Court cases has stated it's a colony. In 1901, Downs versus Bidwell, right, the U.S. Supreme Court said Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not part of the United States. And that is basically where we still are, and it's 2017. Just last year, two U.S. Supreme Court cases. Puerto Rico was trying to find its footing and trying to get some, to challenge those kinds of concepts. But indeed, the United States said, no, you are not a state. You cannot be treated as a state. One of the cases said they're a state for the purposes of sort of bankruptcy, that kind of issue. But in effect, but it still does not address the issue of colony, right? The whole colonial situation. So indeed, it's time and again that the U.S. Supreme Court has stated, the UN, the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization has also declared it, right? When the General Assembly passed a resolution about ending colonies in 2000, by the year 2000, the U.S. was the only dissenting vote. I mean, now I grew up in the U.S., born here, first generation born here, from Puerto Rican parents. I grew up and I still believe in the highest ideals that the U.S. has to put out, freedom, equality, liberty. When you see injustice, you stand up. When, when you're faced with adversity, you rise to the occasion. I believe all of that. And so to me, it hurts me deeply as a Puerto Rican, as a U.S. person, when I see that Puerto Rico is in this situation that it is. The U.S. should not have any colonies. It's right in, the U.S. backyard, so to speak. We're the champion of the free world, but we have a colony. So that should no longer be the case. It's not viable.
Howard, what difference would it have made in the response to the storm if Puerto Rico was a state?
Well, I think that...
I mean, the storm is the storm.
Yeah, I think Maria's right. And by the way, you're remembering your father and everybody else down there in our prayers. And
Thank you.
And no, it's outrageous that people who are U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico have not been treated in the aftermath of these storms the same way citizens in Texas and Florida have been treated. It's the same thing, whether it's Hawaii and Alaska or whatever. U.S. citizens should have the same standard of living and should have the same relationship with their federal government in times of emergency or disaster, wherever they live, right? But the fact of the matter is, if you look at Puerto Rico and why this storm, in addition to being an historically devastating storm, and by the way, my wife comes from an island in Micronesia where they didn't have electricity until 1977. I lived out there, and I've experienced when you don't have medical care, and that's what's going on in Puerto Rico right now. They're doing surgeries, but a lot of people that should be getting emergency medical care are not getting it. I mean, I don't think I read one editorial that said this storm blew Puerto Rico back to the Stone Age. And I think that's an overstatement, but the point is, it is really serious humanitarian crisis on that island. I think that we all need to affirm that. But, if you look at what contributed to the ability of Puerto Rico as a body politic and as a political jurisdiction within the United States to respond to this in a way that would have prevented the extreme hardships that are going on right now, that includes the fact that, back 10, 15 years ago, there was a big controversy over the Vieques target range.
Right.
And so when Puerto Ricans got together and said, we want Vieques shut down, I don't think anybody anticipated that essentially the Congress and the military said, you know what, if we're not going to have Vieques there, all the rest of our support activities on the island aren't necessary anymore. And they pulled the whole military out of Puerto Rico. Roosevelt Roads and everything else. So that blew a $300 million hole in the economy. They lost 6,000 skilled jobs that were good jobs with federal benefits and everything else. And in a state, you have the military there, you have the military present, and they could have played an important role in overcoming some of these logistical problems and turning a response around a lot faster. That's one of the things that differentiates what happened in Puerto Rico and what happened in Texas and Florida. Another thing, but the more fundamental point is that when it comes to how FEMA spends money, if you look at the history of how FEMA spends money in disasters, the fact of the matter is, territories, it's not because anybody has got some sinister plan, but the fact of the matter is that the states are represented in Congress. They have people in Congress who vote, and when you have the ability to vote in Congress, you can inflict pain on other states. That's the we know that from
perpetual
Sandy, motion
the debate over Sandy, right?
The perpetual motion system of the U.S. federal system is that big states can line up with small states can line up together against big states. You have a constantly shifting alignment of political power, and Puerto Rico doesn't participate in that because they don't have voting representation in Congress. And it's interesting when people say, but we're U.S. citizens. Why aren't we being treated equal? Well, 25 years ago, I predicted that it would be a natural disaster that would cause Congress to eventually have to deal with statehood. The reality is that they are citizens, they're U.S. citizens under federal statutory law, but they're not citizens under the Constitution. What is citizenship? Is it a passport? Is it the ability to travel in the United States? Well, yes, and Puerto Rico, people that are born in Puerto Rico and get U.S. citizenship under territorial statute, they can get passports and they can travel in the United States. But if you look at the Constitution itself, what is citizenship? It's very simple. It is the right to vote for representation in Congress, and it is the right to be represented in the Electoral College that selects the president, and the president and the Congress appoint the justices of the Supreme Court. And the only way you can get that under the Constitution, that's not something that the United States could give to Puerto Rico and is holding back from Puerto Rico. The only way you get under Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution, the only way you get to vote is if you're a citizen of a state. voting in federal elections is not a right of national citizenship. It's a right of state citizenship. And so, when you look at what happens when there's a disaster, the reality is the main reason Puerto Rico doesn't get treated the way states get treated is because it doesn't have voting representation in the Electoral College and in the Congress of the United States.
Let me read something that a professor from the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras wrote in the Times on October 24th. His name is Juan Yusti Cordero, and he wrote, Puerto Rico was hit by natural disaster on top of fiscal disaster, on top of our secular disaster of being neither fish nor fowl. Voteless United States citizens, most of whom pay no federal income tax, political and fiscal oddities. Second-class citizens with a second-class disaster. At best, we're seen as American citizens, but not as Americans. With truth be told, doesn't make me lose any sleep. What I am is Puerto Rican. In any case, as a territory, and for better or worse, the Constitution places Puerto Rico under the responsibility of Congress. Maybe invading us in 1898 wasn't such a great idea. We do have a much stronger independence feeling among people in New York than you have on the island. I mean, I think it was 5%, 6% is the kind of the high watermark of the independence movement in various referendums. Why does that feeling exist in New York? And is it an argument about head versus heart?
Well, that's an interesting point. In the 1990s, we made a little study among Puerto Ricans here about the number of independentistas elected officials. And I think that we counted around 12 from Chicago, Connecticut, Philadelphia, New York, who had the most. And I think that we had 12. The Independentista party in Puerto Rico had 2 elected. And I think that that has a lot to do with the experience of the colony. In the colony, all colonies since the Roman Empire, all colonies are administrated by the locals. But the power doesn't belong to the locals. They just administrate the colony. And what you see day to day is your own people basically oppressing you through the orders of the metropole, of the empire. And that's the case also in Puerto Rico. When you migrate to the United States, then you can see the empire. You can see what is being a second-class citizen. You can see
because you have full citizenship rights as soon as you get here.
But even when you can vote in the United States, once you move here, you still see the racism, you still experience the second-class citizen situation of not being taken seriously, even when you are more than prepared than many Native American, Americans, white Americans, and you don't get the jobs. You see all these disparities that you thought you were going to get here, you were going to get some equality when you got here, and it doesn't happen. And that creates a resentment, that creates a sense of who I am. I know now who I am. I know, based on the treatment, I know that I'm not an American because I'm not treated as American.
But how does that factor into and jump in? How does that factor into an independence feeling?
Well, I think it's really important to acknowledge that every president of the United States since Eisenhower, in fact, before that, the United States has never had a problem with independence for Puerto Rico. And every president since Eisenhower said, if the majority votes for Puerto Rico will be an independent nation very quickly. And the reality is the problem of American colonialism in its territories goes back, as she said, to the Downs v. Bidwell case, but it really wasn't the Downs v. Bidwell case that is the problem today. Downs v. Bidwell was just good old-fashioned imperialism and colonialism. The people that were governed in the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam who were subject to that were non-citizens. And so that case essentially said, yeah, you can practice colonialism for non-citizens in these territories. The problem came in 1922 after Congress had granted citizenship. And by the way, there had been petitions from Puerto Rico for citizenship. But the point is, the people that said we want citizenship said, well, but if you're going to give us citizenship, we want statehood because we don't want to end up as a colony. But what happened is in 1922, the Supreme Court, Justice Taft, who had been President of the United States and had been Governor of the Philippines, he issued a ruling that said we could continue to govern Puerto Rico the same way we governed the Philippines as non-citizens, even though they're citizens. And in other words, in essence, what Taft said in 1922 in the Balzac case was that citizenship doesn't matter. And so that's where you get this institutionalized second-class citizenship. But I think it's really important to go back and compare what the United States did in the Philippines and and it really is what the United States needs to do right now.
And Hawaii.
In 1916, Congress passed a law saying the Philippines is going to be an independent country. We're not going to give them citizenship, and they're going to be independent. And after that, that was in 1916. In 1934, they passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, leading to commonwealth and independence. And the Japanese invaded during World War II, and right after World War II, we gave them their independence. At the same time, we gave statehood to Hawaii and Alaska. The reality is, in that period after World War II, when the process of decolonization was being institutionalized in the United Nations under the United Nations Charter, Puerto Rico should have been either been put on the same track as the Philippines in independence, or it should have been put on the same track as Hawaii and Alaska. And it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was not because of the United States. The reason was because in Puerto Rico, there's a faction, a political faction, that actually harkens back to the period under Spanish colonial rule, which was much more harsh than United States colonial rule. But there's a faction in Puerto Rico that said, we don't want independence. We don't want statehood. There was the governor, Luis Muñoz Marin. He said, we want autonomy. And they wanted to base it on the model of autonomy that Spain had granted to Puerto Rico before the U.S. annexed the islands, and also the model of autonomy in Catalonia and Basque in Spain. And the reality is that in the United States, if you have citizenship, and you're not on a track to statehood, which means this is the only way to get to equality, or if you're in a colony of the United States, a territorial colony, and you want independence, unless you're on a track to independence. And it was that autonomy doctrine. Let's not do either. Let's try to have the best of both worlds. That is what has prevented Puerto Rico from becoming either a nation or a state. Now, I guess I would call it good news, is that the Commonwealth regime that pretended to be sovereign, as you said, in the Sanchez-Valier case in 2016, the Supreme Court, with Associate Justice Kagan wrote the decision, said, no, Commonwealth is not a form of sovereignty. There is no separate sovereignty in Puerto Rico, which means it is a colony. And so now, I'll wrap it up by just saying this. It's now time for the Congress of the United States, in the light of Maria, and I think Maria is going to force this to happen. How are we going to spend tens, if not $100 billion rebuilding this island if we don't know if it's going to become an independent state or an independent nation or a state? Because how you spend money if it's going to become a nation is different than how you're going to spend it if it's going to become a state. And it's time for Congress to make a decision. It doesn't have to give statehood now or independence immediately, but it has to say, this is where we're going, guys. And that decision has to be made, and it has to be based on self-determination in the territory.
If indeed the presidents have said all this time that it's up to Puerto Rico and they believe in they could go independence, that would be something. I don't know that to be true, but I would have to differ, Howard, because if that was the case, that's a very convenient argument from the presidents of the United States, because in reality, when there has been a sort of a strong momentum for independence during the 1930s, the nationalist movement, there was a whole resurgence. People were very uncomfortable and dissatisfied with the fact that, all of a sudden, most of the lands belonged to American absentee landowners, that their food was 80% of it had to be imported into Puerto Rico, in a place where you can actually grow food all year round. And so then, and again, the Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, right? That whole thing about not allowing anybody else except U.S. ships with, owned by the U.S., staffed by U.S. personnel, et cetera, to bring foods or to bring goods into Puerto Rico at a much higher rate, mind you, which higher cost, which has impacted now what has happened during Hurricane Maria, because when other nations wanted to help out, it was like, no, you can't do that. So President Trump actually waived it for 10 days at the request. There was so much sort of protest against that he said, okay, I'll waive it. But they only did it for 10 days. And that's not going to help the situation much. So just to finish up, It's a very convenient argument if the presidents have indeed stated that, well, they don't want their independence. They want to choose this or that, Luis Muñoz Marin.
Well,
no,
yeah.
that's sort of,
Yeah.
if that was the case, they wouldn't have intervened. The FBI wouldn't have been in Puerto Rico trying to disrupt and trying to interrupt and trying to foil every single plan for independence. There was a really serious wave of backlash and fear imprinted upon the Puerto Rican people that even if you spoke, about independence, you couldn't even have your own flag in Puerto Rico. You couldn't fly it. Yes, the gag order. You couldn't even fly your own flag. You couldn't talk about independence. You couldn't gather and say, hey, we want to, talk about this and write about this. No, at the risk of imprisonment.
Yeah.
So indeed, there was a really, fear was put into the people. So they've sort of remained in this sort of commonwealth because they were afraid of independence, because they've been made to be afraid of independence and the consequences of independence, right? Imprisonment. Or, statehood, no, we feel ourselves a separate nation. We don't want statehood. We want to be our own people in our own country. So
does that mean that they're stuck in this status?
I think now, is a good time to sort of talk and really have serious discussions and perhaps once restoration and recovery has taken place, that education, I'm an educator and that, I always bring up the case of Puerto Rico with my students. I force them to become Puerto Ricans for the project. I divide them into the three major parties for commonwealth, statehood and independence, and I have them go at it, and they debate. Yeah. And that's coming forthwith. But, education is part of it. So I think the people of Puerto Rico have to be given a serious opportunity to consider statehood or independence. Commonwealth is not viable.
Yeah.
I agree.
I agree with your analysis in terms of the Supreme Court cases, and that's fine. But one thing is the Supreme Court cases and Supreme Court decisions, and another thing is the will of the government, of the federal government of the United States in Puerto Rico. The repression in Puerto Rico, again, to say that the United States will grant the independence of Puerto Rico if Puerto Ricans wanted it. Everything that the United States has done in Puerto Rico since the invasion in 1898 is to prevent the development of the independentista movement in Puerto Rico. People have been in jail in thousands in Puerto Rico just for being in for asking for the independence of Puerto Rico.
And some have disappeared.
Yeah, but not only that, just having the flag in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican flag was a crime in Puerto Rico. Just to talk about independence was a crime in Puerto Rico. And it was copied, the gag order was a copy of the Smith Law that basically McCarthy was trying to push in the United States. So to say that the Americans are willing to accept any of the three statuses the Puerto Ricans decide, I think that they're okay with the current status because they also don't want statehood.
Why?
But because it's the same lie. To say that they're okay with
Why
independence.
don't they want statehood?
Because a couple of reasons. First, you're going to have a 51st state that is not going to be speaking English. The majority of the people are going to be, and Hawaii is an issue. You want to bring Philippines and Hawaii. Hawaii became a state of the United States after the majority of the people were speaking English. That's number one. Number two, you are going to have the budget of the United States that I think that was part of the discussion at the beginning. The federal budget that now is divided among 50 states, now it has to be divided with another state, 51. That means less federal monies for the 50 states that currently are enjoying that part of the budget. Third, and this is a fact of history in terms of Puerto Rico and the United States, you are going to have a militant independentista movement in the United States that you don't want to have that headache. You're going to have another...
As a statehood debate.
I'm going to be very blunt. You're going to have another Northern Island. If you think that Puerto Ricans are not willing, they have been doing that since 1898. So there are three reasons why the United States will think hard and long before having Puerto Rico to become a state.
Well, first of all, I think if you look at if you look at the history of the 32 territories that have become states, it's a very different story than the story that's being painted right here. First of all,
it's a very different island.
I'm about to explain why I don't think that's the case. There were independence movements in Vermont There was bigger independence movement in Texas than there is in Puerto Rico. There was bigger independence movement in Alaska.
Some people
you know.
support
Yeah.
the Texas independence
Well,
movement,
yeah,
but that's
right.
but that's a separate.
Yeah, but you know, let's look at the history of how territories become states. You look at, for example, Louisiana. Louisiana was admitted as it was purchased by the United States, annexed under the agreement with France and Spain in 1803. It was a backward, economically undeveloped place, and the population spoke French and Spanish. There was a much smaller percentage of people who spoke English in Louisiana. And 9 years later, in 1812, while we were at war with Britain, Louisiana was admitted to the Union. That shows that the United States, what happens with territories, when things get bad enough, territories don't get admitted because everybody's just happy. There's always in every territory an element that doesn't want statehood because they're getting rich under territorial status. But please let me just finish.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is that every territory has gotten to the point where it becomes a state when the only thing worse than admitting it as a state is to leave it as a territory. And I think Maria is going to be, and I predicted it 25 years ago, I think Maria is going to be the thing that's going to force the Congress to either say, you know, the only thing worse, because statehood provides an equal footing and participation in the national economy with the other states. That's why Puerto Rico does not have a hardened infrastructure, because it's been in this limbo commonwealth status, and it hasn't developed the private sector capacity and it hasn't developed the public sector capacity to withstand something like this the way Texas, and there's no hardened infrastructure there. And that is something, now I want to go back to something that was said here because it's really important. The discussion of what the local government did with respect to the militant independence party elements and what the federal government did with respect to militant, violent independistas in Puerto Rico and in the United States. And I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but it happened. I will agree there was suppression of civil rights during that period by the local government.
No, by the federal government.
And by the federal government in response to violence. But listen, the fact of the matter is that in 1952, the people of the island in an island-wide referendum voted by a significant majority that their U.S. citizenship was paramount to them, and they wanted a political status that preserved their U.S. citizenship. And the fact of the matter is that whether it's Guam, or whether it's the Northern Mariana Islands, or whether it's the Virgin Islands, or whether it's American Samoa, or in the case of my wife's islands, the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands that did vote for independence, the United States gave them independence even though we had strategic military bases in those Micronesian islands that were far more important to us than the bases in Puerto Rico, as evidenced by the fact that we shut the bases down.
I think that you're forgetting the geopolitical situation of Puerto Rico during all these years.
Well,
especially during
the
70s, you have Cuba, you have a
well, then let's go back to the Spanish period, which was much worse.
You have a communist country that the United States don't agree with in the middle of the Caribbean, who is for the independence of Puerto Rico. You are in this geopolitical fight, in this Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the last thing that you wanted was to have Puerto Rico to become free.
May I please respond?
The repression that it was created from the beginning, but especially during that period of time, and I know because I live it. You know, I had FBI agents, and I'm just a nice guy. I have FBI agents just because I was hanging out with independentistas, coming to visit relatives of mine, asking, what am I doing with those people?
Yeah.
You know, and this was not the local government of Puerto Rico. This was the FBI, the local government of any empire, of any colonial situation obeys the instructions from the metropole.
And it was at a time.
So it's not the local government.
It was at a time when independentists from Puerto Rico attempted to shoot President Truman. It's a time when they stood up in the gallery of the House and opened fire on the members of the Congress. It's a time when they bombed Francis Tavern in New York and killed policemen. But the point is, I will agree with you. During the Cold War period,
you know, George Washington did those things too, and the founding fathers, they also went to war.
That's exactly, that's what
so
war
we
is.
can go to war too, you know.
Wars for independence are ugly things. My point is this: I agree with your point that during the Cuban crisis and during the confrontation over Cuba in the United Nations, both the local government in Puerto Rico and the federal government took action against the independentistas. But I want to point out that that wasn't done by the United States alone by any means. When we went into the United Nations in 1953, and I think misleadingly told the United Nations that Puerto Rico had been decolonized, which it hadn't been, that wasn't something the United States did. The idea of doing that came from Luis Muñoz Marin, who was widely and popularly elected by the people of Puerto Rico. So when we went in and played that hoax on the United Nations in 1953,
One of the many.
it
Yeah, I
was
agree with you.
it was Luis Muñoz Marin and Jose Trias Monge and later Rafael Hernandez Colon. It was the autonomists in Puerto Rico who were the ones that the United States, when they came and said, let's go to the United Nations and say Commonwealth makes us no longer a colony. The United States, the people in the State Department said, hey, let's do it. And they were the ones that went in and supported the United States and the United Nations doing that. So you can't really say that the suppression of independence movement comes from the United States. It comes primarily from the Commonwealth Party in Puerto Rico.
Maria,
Go ahead.
Well, Governor Luis Muñoz Marin, regretted many things toward the ends there. He ran 4 times successfully for 16 years he was governor. And he was sort of disillusioned, wrote some memoirs, and spoke about some of the disappointments. Right? He had hoped. His vision wasn't for autonomy or Commonwealth. He had this vision that we'll do this for now, but I believe in independence, and that's where we should be headed. I just never quite got there, and it became much more difficult than
Commonwealth
he thought.
prevented.
See, I would think not. I would think that the pressure on him to try to maintain peace and stability in Puerto Rico was actually what prompted that.
The United Nations.
That's Exhibit A.
But I do want to bring the focus back. Let me start with you, Maria, a little bit more to the statehood question. Because of the devastation, Maria, which is,
my namesake, I know.
Yes, I know.
And the most holy among Roman Catholics, right? It's sort of a horrible name for that hurricane.
does this change? Do people feel that? Rosselló, the governor, is a pro-statehood governor. The last referendum, highly criticized as to who did take part, who didn't take part, how the choices were presented, was essentially a pro-statehood referendum. There's a strong feeling in Puerto Rico, if for no other reason than independence would cost us all this access to the United States that we have now. The safety valve of American citizenship. Why is it as strong as it is?
I have to disagree that it's as strong as you're saying.
Yes, no.
The vote took place in June of this year, the referendum. It took place, first of all, when they knew, okay? They knew, Governor Rosselló, and the Statehood Party, they knew that Puerto Ricans were celebrating the National Puerto Rican Day Parade. That was the day. It's stated every year. We know when it's going to happen. So they know that many people are going to be gone from the island to begin with because they participate in this National Puerto Rican Day Parade that we hold in New York City every year. That's part of it. The next part is that many people boycotted. They said,
yes.
Wait a minute, we're not gonna even show up. This is, we don't like the way this went. They didn't, consult or collaborate.
But without even looking at
so the
this.
77% of the people,
Right. But without even looking at this referendum, traditionally, it seems to me, as an outsider, I am not Puerto Rican. Spend a lot of time on the island. I'm not Puerto Rican. I don't have the. It's not in my blood. But there is.
Well,
go ahead. No, I'm just saying. It seems as if, to an outsider, that there has been a steady movement towards statehood on the island, if for no other reason, because they don't want to lose the rights as American citizens that they have now under this neither fish nor fowl status.
Well, it seems sort of reasonable, right? Puerto Rico's been under the U.S. for 119 years, U.S. citizens. So people are sort of like, well, let's just get this going. Maybe things will get better. So I think there is some momentum towards statehood. But I think that, this is sort of, this whole situation, there are still many people who, it's sort of a competition, so to speak, between statehood and commonwealth. And again, as I said before, I think the sort of the fallback is that, some people are afraid of independence. It is a serious, it's a sacrifice. You have to, know that, much planning is going to have to go in it. I think they're afraid of the unknown, like many of us are, And so I think that plays into the part of why, but they don't want statehood. They sort of see themselves, they sort of shout the loudest when they come up against the U.S. in, different games, et cetera. So, there is a sense, yes, there is a sense of us and them that Puerto Ricans see because they want to keep who they are. But, the fear of, that has been played upon over and over is that you can't make it as an independent country. But, there are countries who have made it as an independent country.
It's really interesting, especially in terms of your question, because what is happening right now in Puerto Rico, what is happening, and my conversations with people in the island, et cetera, and people who are coming from there, is that Puerto Ricans are developing a more nationalistic feeling in terms of their relation with the United States. They see what is happening, which is what I was talking about before in terms of those of us that migrate to the United States.
They see the neglect.
They see the neglect. They see now that they are not complete citizens of the United States. But they also see the treatment. They also see the racism. They see what happened with Trump. They see what is happening, the way FEMA is distributing food. There is footage in Puerto Rico that's being distributed all over now. Not everybody's seen it because of lack of electricity. But the rumors are there. How the helicopters, they just throw the food in places where there are no people just to get rid of it. So there is a lot of evidence of how FEMA is not giving their 100%, not all of them. Some of them are really trying hard. But it's not only the fact that Trump is saying that everything is fine because of his ego, it's also that now the people who are delivering these goods that don't look like us, they don't see us the same way that they see the people in Texas. However, we think, many of us think, that the people of the United States, not the government of the United States, has been more responsive than the federal government in terms of Puerto Rico. There are veterans from West Virginia, from the South, who are in the island right now helping the island. And they are not being sent by the United States. But now people are seeing what is happening in terms of the relationship with the United States directly, not through the gatekeepers.
Great. Yes, tell us your name and your campus.
Hi, my name is Daryl Bob. I'm from John Jay College. Earlier you gave a lot of reasons why the United States would consider long and hard why they wouldn't consider Puerto Rico a state. Could you give some of the benefits to why they would or gain something from it?
Well, one of the benefits, I think that it was stated by everybody here, is the fact that you don't have any representation in Congress. So you cannot go. We have a representative in Congress who have no votes.
A non-voting representative commission.
It's just there basically transmitting messages and taking messages back. It's a messenger. But we don't have, for example, if Puerto Rico was a state, Puerto Rico will have 2 senators, like any other state, and it will have an average of 8 to 7 representatives in the House of Representatives. Well, that's a lot of representation. It will have more representation than some states like Mississippi. But, for example, Puerto Rico, which on the other side, another point that I didn't mention before, Puerto Rico will be then the poorest state in the nation if it becomes state, which is another reason why the United States
doesn't want them.
Based on the other questions. Let me finish. Because, for example, Puerto Rico makes the average, $15,000 less than the average in a state of Mississippi, which is it becomes a bigger problem for the United States having Puerto Rico as state than having it as it is now or as independent.
Yeah, the thing about it is I thought your question also went to the issue of what's in it for the United States. And the reality is this.
Look here.
It's not good for our country, and it's not in the national interest of the United States for us to have 3.5 million people who don't have equal rights of citizenship. That's not good for the United States. Our model of government was created in the Constitution. Our model of government that we have in the Constitution was not created to govern people who don't have equal rights. Our system only works right when you have equal rights. And the thing about it is, Puerto Rico has just, most territories that became states, at the time they became states, were the poorest states in the Union. The point is, the model of rule of law, the model of equal rights as a citizen, the empowerment of people. And our country is a success story of how racism has been overcome and has been defeated, and our Constitution doesn't say perfect, it says more perfect. And the work of making our union more perfect goes on, and bringing Puerto Rico in as a 51st state is the next step in the work. If Puerto Rico is going to remain U.S. citizenship under U.S. sovereignty, then it needs to become a state. If it's not going to become a state, it needs to become an independent nation. And I think that you can look at the history of the 32 territories that became states. When you have uniform taxation, and by the way, I want to correct something since we've got students here. Puerto Ricans pay over $3.5 billion a year in federal taxes. Mm-hmm. They pay taxes on all of their income in the states, all of their income overseas, and they pay a local tax for the local government that is actually a surrogate entity of the federal government. So that's a form of a federal tax too. So the idea that they're not paying taxes, and the last thing I'll say is this: if they don't become a state, if the underdevelopment that's chronic there, and if they don't recover from this storm, and if we don't rebuild it, then what's going to happen is it's going to be depopulated. And what's going to happen, those people, because they're paying payroll taxes, they're paying Social Security taxes, they're paying Medicare taxes, they're eligible for full benefits in the states. They're going to leave Puerto Rico, and they're going to bankrupt the state of Florida's healthcare budget, and they're going to bankrupt Pennsylvania and New York and Illinois too. If you get another and in the last 8 years, 900,000 people have moved off that island, as we said, voting for statehood with their feet. They don't want to wait around for all this political status nonsense. And if we don't sort this out now, you're going to have another 1 million or 1.5 million people moving to the States.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Flores. I'm from Queens College. I wanted to ask Howard Hills, aside from the moral obligation that we have, that the United States has, with the crisis that is occurring in Puerto Rico, why specifically should they choose to be independent or acquire sovereignty? Like, why should they have to do that in order for us to help them?
They don't have to.
Look here, Howard.
I'm sorry.
Just,
The reality is this. I agree with what's been said here tonight by all of us, and it is this limbo status they've been in since 1950, which really goes back to 1920, has prevented them from becoming vested and taking control of their own destiny as a body politic. And they've become dependent on federal subsidies in ways that states don't. And when territories become states, they experience somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% growth for about 2 decades. And they grow their way because they've got uniform taxation, they got representation in Congress, so they get their fair share of natural resources and national resources and financial resources. And that's how states evolve, but you can't evolve when you're US citizens, but you can't be a state. So the answer is that if they want sovereignty in the form that states have sovereignty, which is subject then to the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution, that's the way to empower themselves.
Okay.
If they don't empower themselves that way, they need to empower themselves through independence.
Yeah, I would have to say that, just because they're moving from Puerto Rico to the United States doesn't mean they're voting statehood with their feet. I think that's a misconception because, the U.S. can't have it both ways. The U.S. is the supervisor, the colonizer of Puerto Rico, controlling the economy, etc. That whole debt that Puerto Rico has incurred was under the supervision of the United States. That wasn't that, Puerto Rican, some leadership in Puerto Rico, it should be audited, they should be held responsible, people should go to jail. But the United States has been there all along. And so that the whole thing of, the U.S. is actually been orchestrating what's going on in Puerto Rico. So they're leaving, but that's as a result of what the U.S. is precisely doing. So that, in that sense, we can't have it both ways in terms of the U.S.
yes, ma'am.
I'm Natalie Fraser-Jones from John Jay College, and my question is, does Puerto Rico have what it needs internally to become a stable economy?
Well, we were ready to be independent in 1898 when the United States invaded Puerto Rico, 8 days after Puerto Rico became sovereign from Spain. The first thing that the United States did was that they, in those first 12 days, was to devalue el peso in Puerto Rico. So the peso had a value of 40% of what it used to have. Then the United States corporations and the banks came, and that devaluation basically made the farmers start losing their properties because the banks, American banks, start giving them unconscionable loans to them. So from the beginning, they start taking not only the economy, but also the land. That practice exists to this day. The result of the crisis, like Maria was saying at the beginning, is the result of that colonial style in the United States taking advantage of Puerto Rico.
I'd like to add.
No, well, but not only in terms of the economical aspect and the political aspect, they have controlled Puerto Rico. They also did the same thing with Cuba for a while, even when Puerto Rico, they didn't, they let,
After the Spanish
they let
American
Cuba
War.
go. The biggest pirates of the Caribbean is the United States.
I'm
In
sorry.
terms of all the monies that they have stolen, Puerto Rico received $4 billion in assistance from the United States, $4 billion every year. The United States, through the Jones Act, and through Puerto Rico is the number 4 buyer of American products in the world, being a territory. Puerto Rico contributes to the American economy $71 billion a year, while receives $4 billion. Look at the discrepancy.
Well, go ahead quickly, because I
Well-
want to get more questions in.
First of all, Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico is bigger than Rhode Island. It's as big as Delaware. It has coastal zone bigger than South Carolina. The fact is, Puerto Rico has everything it needs. All it needs is a viable model of a political economy, and that's either independence or it's statehood.
We agree on that.
And the reality is that it's the lack of the uniformity of law and equal footing with the other states that's preventing Puerto Rico from developing. Now, the reality is the United States is going to have to put somewhere between 25 and 100 billion dollars into Puerto Rico right now. There's an opportunity to rebuild this island. But the idea that the United States orchestrated this, what's being said here tonight is a revisionist history, and what it's doing is it's
We can say the
devaluing
same.
democracy in Puerto Rico because they elected the leaders that asked for the federal subsidies in terms of the corporate tax shelters. I'm glad Congress got rid of the corporate tax shelters in 2006, but now they're blaming it. They're blaming the insolvency that took place on the removal of those tax shelters. Their leaders who were elected asked for those and resisted their removal. But the fact of the matter is Puerto Ricans didn't have any say in it because they don't have a representation in Congress. And one last point I want to make. Puerto
It's a
Rico
contradiction.
elects Republican governors, elects Republican mayors. Sometimes the mayors in Puerto Rico have been majority Republican. They elect Republican resident commissioners, non-voting delegates in Congress. So I think both parties, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, will be competitive in Puerto Rico. I also just want to say that the Jones Act applies to Guam, Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, and other areas. And the Jones Act is an issue, but it's not a
doesn't
U.S.
apply to the US
conspiracy.
Virgin Islands.
It's not. Well, I'm sorry. You're correct. It applies to Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and a couple other places. But the point is, the Jones Act is not a conspiracy aimed
All
at
right,
Puerto
let me
Rico.
just take another
It's just
question.
a-
We have
No,
not
it's aimed at Guam, at Alaska. and
No,
Puerto
it's
Rico.
We have,
aimed at
except I
at
want to take
foreign
another
ships,
question.
is
I'm
what-
glad
But we're
you
not alone.
mentioned the Virgin Islands because we have not discussed the Virgin Islands, which is in a comparable state
Yeah.
of destruction. And Puerto Rico has been getting the attention because of the problems there, but the Virgin Islands are Americans as well.
Absolutely.
So, yes, ma'am, quickly, please.
Hi, my name is Danish. I am from Baruch College. My question is for Professor Maria. Since you are a Puerto Rican nation, how do you feel as of right now? What should Puerto Rico be independent? Do you think they're able to be? It's best for them to be an independent state as of right now?
Yes, the simple version of that is yes. I mean, Puerto Rico's economy was already right in devastation. The hurricanes just quadrupled that, or devastated even further that situation in Puerto Rico. But I think that Puerto Rico can become an independent nation. I don't see a problem with that. With dual citizenship, There are many countries, at least 60 countries, that have dual citizenship with the United States. I don't think that's a problem. I also think that the United States has a responsibility in helping Puerto Rico rebuild, even if it becomes independent, because of the many years that Puerto Rico has been subjugated under the U.S. So, you know, I don't see that. The U.S. has profited from Puerto Rico. They can reinvest in Puerto Rico, make it better, stronger, and they can say, you know, we will, you know, grant you independence. Again, the only people that can grant independence to Puerto Rico right now, unless it's a bloody revolution, is the United States Congress. So, you know, the U.S. has a responsibility to do that, and I think should do that.
If the elected legislature of Puerto Rico passed a resolution asking for independence tomorrow, the United States would grant independence.
Okay, let me
to Puerto
get
Rico.
one more. Let me get one more question in.
True.
It is true.
Good evening, and thank you very much. My name is Bukari Salogo. I'm from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Well, my question is, given all the recent negative reports about FEMA, how would statehood help improve the quality of life on the island post-Maria?
I don't think that, look, I have to be very honest. New Orleans went through this. It was a state, Louisiana was a state, New Orleans. And Katrina, we know what happened with Katrina. You know, it was devastated. And it was gentrified after that big time. I think that we're in the same path in terms of Puerto Rico. I don't think that by Puerto Rico becoming a state of the United States, I think that the response would have been different. You know, it's 3 million people of color, you know, and same as New Orleans. I don't think that the response, I think that the response that we're getting today is basically the same response that we got at the beginning with New Orleans. And that was a state. So I don't think that we can expect much on that. I think that there are some federal governments, there are some presidents that are more sensitive than others. And I think that it can vary in terms of the response, the level of the response. But if history tells us something, is that people of color in the United States, the history of the United States, and even the Constitution of the United States has discriminated against people of color, which has cemented this.
I'm about to run out of time. I always make deadline. I want to thank you all for joining us on CUNY Forum, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sit tight.